Hi, I'm Angela Walters from quiltingismytherapy.com, and I just got home from QuiltCon in Austin, Texas, where I had a blast. I taught a lot of classes and actually gave 2 lectures as well. One of the lectures was called Becoming a Better Quilter, and this lecture was unlike anything I normally do. Instead of giving them ideas for picking quilting designs, I turned the tables a little bit and gave them tips for making their practice sessions more productive, showed them how to hide quilting mistakes without taking them out, and then finished up with 3 things that they could stop doing to enjoy the quilting process more. The response to the lecture was great, and I thought it would be fun to share those 3 things that you could stop doing as well, just in case you weren't able to make it to the lecture or QuiltCon at all. Now, when we're learning machine quilting, or really any other skill, we probably go to books or tutorials and get ideas for things that we should do to make that process a little bit easier. But instead of telling you what you should do, I'm going to tell you 3 things you should stop doing. The first one is stop comparing your worst to everybody's best. We all do this on some level, whether unconsciously or whether we're totally aware. I think about the times that I get on social media and I see that this lady is a great mom, and this other one wrote 3 books in a year, and she finished a hand applique quilt. I don't even know how to hand applique. It's so easy to get discouraged when we compare where we're at with the best of several other people. I think the quote that sums this up the best is, "Comparison is the thief of joy." How often have you finished a project, let's say a quilt or something like that, and felt so proud of it until you got to Quilt Guild and the lady before you in the show and tell showed off an even more stunning quilt? It can be easy to let that overwhelm you or to even discourage you, but the fact of the matter is you're doing your best quilting right now, and enjoy the process of learning. When I learned how to quilt over 12 years ago, I didn't have Instagram and there weren't tutorials and not even really very many blogs about it. In fact, it was just me and my husband's grandpa quilting together. Now, that meant it took a lot longer for me to learn how to machine quilt, for sure, because I was teaching myself, and that means I had the worst teacher ever. But I also enjoyed it because every step was a mini victory. I thought, wow, I finally mastered the leaf meander, and then I could move on to the next one. So instead of beating myself up for not being where everybody else was yet, I was enjoying the steps along the way. So be proud of where you are right now and enjoy that. I think about when we go to show and tell at guilds, right? You hold up your project and everybody tells you how great it is. That's what it should be like. You should be your own cheering squad. The second thing that you could stop doing is stop pointing out your mistakes. Don't point out your mistakes. Don't point out your mistakes. Do not point out your mistakes. As I travel and teach and give lectures, you would not believe how many people will point out their mistakes to me. And I say, I don't care. I'm proud of what you're doing. This looks great all over. So when somebody comes up to you and says, oh, I love your quilt, or your quilting looks great, just say thank you. You may know that there's mistakes in there, but the thing about it is our eyes see perfection in other people's stuff. So when somebody else is looking at your quilt, they're seeing the overall package and they're not thinking about those little errors that they don't even know are there. It's kind of like the idea that you could take a picture of 10 women and show a picture of it to each of the women, and they would say that they all look the worst. We are our own worst critics, but instead of pointing out your mistakes, just say thank you. Now, I know that could be hard for some people, so if you don't feel comfortable saying thanks, say something like, I had fun doing it, or I'm glad to finally get it finished, something like that. Because when you turn down their compliment by pointing out a negative aspect of your quilt, you're kind of telling them that they're not being truthful. So don't point out your mistakes, whether it's to your family, your friends, or even your quilting customers. And lastly, don't forget the purpose of the quilt. If you've ever taken a class from me, if you've ever read my blog, and if you remember nothing else, I hope you will remember this. Do not forget the purpose of your quilt. If you've ever been quilting and you're looking 2 inches from your face, it could be so easy to see every mistake and to use that as an opportunity to berate yourself or not be proud of what you're doing. But instead of focusing on an area that is that big, focus on the purpose of the quilt. Is the quilt meant to be on your bed and it's a quilt that you finally finished for yourself and it's made out of that out-of-print fabric that you were so scared to use? Then think about how great it's going to be to use that. Is the quilt for a 2-year-old boy, maybe your grandson or your son? Instead of focusing on your squares not being so straight, think about how he's going to love having a tangible reminder of your love for him. And lastly, I have some pictures to share that I think will show you how this point works out. Everybody has those very precious quilts, right? The quilts that they would be devastated if anything happened to them. They're irreplaceable. And I actually have 2 of those as well. The first quilt is a tie quilt, and it's made from a bunch of different ties. And what makes this quilt so precious is that it's the last quilt my husband's grandpa made before he passed away. When I look at this quilt, all I think about is him coming out of the thrift store with bags of ties. And I would say, "Grandpa, we don't need so many ties." And he would say, "Oh, they were only $4. I had to buy them." The second quilt that means so much to me is another one that he pieced before he passed away. This quilt he pieced for my daughter and gave me the top to quilt. And of course, like any other quilter, I stuck it in my UFO stash not to finish it. Now, if you look at the quilting of the 2, the quilting on the tie quilt is very large swirls. This is not an example of my best quilting for sure. And if you see that round black circle there, that is the camera lens. That will give you a scale of just how large this quilting is. Whereas the quilting on the red and green quilt is a really good example of where I was at the time. What I love about the quilting on this quilt is that I didn't quilt it until several years after he passed away, but it was actually for a book with C&T Publishing about Amish quilts. And I love that it shows his style of piecing with my style of quilting, and it's our only collaborative quilt that's been published, and it makes it really precious to me. Now, when you look at the quilts and the quilting, you might think that the second one looks way better, and I would actually agree with that as well. The quilting is a lot more thought out, a lot more specific to the quilt, but actually the first quilt means so much more to me. You see, when he was diagnosed with cancer, we knew he wouldn't have long to live, and I took that quilt top home, the tie quilt, and finished it just as fast as I could. And my grandma bound it, and we ran it to him at the hospital. And do you think he cared that the quilting wasn't the best that he'd ever seen? No. He was just glad to see it finished, and he said, "I never thought I would see it finished." Do you think in that moment that green and red quilt was more important to him? No, because it was just a top somewhere else. This was a finished quilt. And even though it wasn't my best work, it was still done. And he taught me that a finished quilt is always better than a perfect quilt top. Now, I don't tell you this story to make you sad or make it depressing, but the idea is, if we're using our quilts as only an opportunity to feel worse about the job we're doing, then we're missing the whole point of it at all. Our quilts serve a much greater purpose, and if we can finish them and give them on or use them, then everybody's a lot happier. So remember this, a finished quilt is always better than a perfect quilt top. Thanks so much, and happy quilting.